Here we go. Hey, everyone. I think we're live. Yes, indeed. And it looks like we have people rolling in. This is fantastic. Happy Thursday. Thank you so much, everyone who's joining us today. My name's Greg Hanscom. I am the Executive Director and Publisher at High Country News. To introduce to you our all-star panel. This is kind of spur of the moment. I wasn't supposed to be the one doing this, so bear with me for just a moment. Checking in from my basement. I wanted to let you all know before we get started that this is the second of a series of events that we'll be doing. We've got a recording of the first of these events up on our website, and that included a group of former High Country News editors. And if you're interested in watching that, it was a great conversation, some classic stories of the Tom Bell days at High Country News. So check out our website for that. There is this event today, which will run for about an hour. And this is all a lead up to an event on June 4th, which is the Capstone Event for our 50th anniversary celebration for High Country News. We've been celebrating our 50th anniversary for a year and a half now. So we are, it's been a great ride, but we're going to be happy to wrap that up. Hope you all can join us on June 4th. Again, you can find some information on our website at www.hcn.org/50-years. There's some information there about the West Illuminated event. That again is June 4th. And that's a big fundraiser. We're going to hear from John Echohawk, Claudia Castro Luna, Washington State's former poet laureate, and some other great speakers that evening. So thank you again for joining us. Looks like we've got about 80 people in the room, in the Zoom room. And from here, I'm going to turn it over to HCN's new editor-in-chief, Jennifer Sahn, to introduce the rest of the crew. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Craig. It is so great to be here with everybody. Thank you all who are attending, those who are just showing up. We are here to talk about the future of High Country News and journalism in the West. And I'm Jennifer Sahn, and joining me here on this panel are our photo editor, Bear Guerra, assistant editor, Jessica Coots, interim associate editor, Brian Pollard, assistant editor, Carl Sagerstrom, and features director, McKenna Stainer. This is about a third of our editorial staff. We have folks all over the West. We're a dispersed staff these days. So everybody's coming to you from their home offices, and we're here to just talk about the magazine and share a little bit about the work that we do and answer some questions at the end. There's a Q&A box floating around somewhere where you can put your questions in there, and we'll circle back. We'll leave time at the end for those. It is really great to be here. This is my 6th week as editor-in-chief, which means I'm really just getting started. And it's clear to me, stepping into this position, that High Country News has a really unique relationship with its community, which is to say all of you. Already in my short time here, I've received tips, messages of encouragement, heartfelt critiques, and expressions of joy, most of them unsolicited, folks showing up in my inbox weekly to make sure we know about things that are happening, to share feedback, and to just say, hey, you guys are great. I've received more, hey, you guys are great messages in 6 weeks on this job than I think I did in any previous job I had. So thank you all for that. We love hearing from you. And then it means a lot to us that you would take the time to share your feedback with us. We wouldn't be doing this work without you. So you're the reason we're here. I'm here to tell you, as I convene this discussion on the future of High Country News, that the future of High Country News is strong. We are in a great position to be leading a conversation about the West for many years to come. We have a great staff. Everybody's doing a lot of hard work to keep the magazine healthy and to make sure that we are competitive and following the right stories and doing our best work. Which is not to say that the media environment doesn't pose challenges. It does. I've been working in magazines for 25 years, and for most of that time, there have been major questions about business models and platforms and how to find and grow your audience. Some people say that the industry is disrupted, but it's really been the norm now for quite some time. So I tend to call it something more stable, just constant evolution. If nothing else, it keeps us on our toes. There's not a lot that can come from sticking to old rules in an environment that's evolving this quickly, and there's potentially a lot to learn from breaking them. So we're really looking forward in our work and not looking back to repeat the past, but to find the new thing and to do it in a new way. And what's really clear is that the future of journalism is not going to look like the past. So it's up to us to see what the future brings and to really lead that future in our region. What we know is it's going to require us to be good at very specific things and to be expert on certain subjects. And if this pandemic has taught us anything, it's to expect the unexpected. And the models only work as long as they're viable. And so many fantastic publications have gone out of business in the last year, the last decade. You can't believe that anyone has found an answer to this when you see really fantastic publications that are failing for some reason, having nothing to do with the excellence of their content. News in the West has lost a lot of infrastructure, and I think what it means for us is that we can't be competing always for the same stories with different outlets in the region. I feel that we'll be relying a lot more on partnerships and resource sharing. And we're already doing quite a bit of that. That allows us also to cross-pollinate our audiences, and I think helps us work together with other media organizations to create a better informed citizenry in the West. We're pursuing partnerships. We're getting approached all the time by folks who want to be in partnership with us, and we're being strategic about this, but we're also really excited to be playing a leading role and just be thinking about the sort of family of media and news organizations that serve our region. Our land grab universities story, which has won a Polk Award and several other awards and is now a finalist for a National Magazine Award, was a three-way partnership. We had two other media organizations working with us on that fantastic, really important story. So that gives you some sense of what the future might look like. We have big issues to cover. We have drought and fire and land use, environmental justice and energy and Indigenous sovereignty. We have a lot of work to do. A lot is changing and changing quickly. And we're up to it. And with your help, we will do it, and we will continue to lead the conversation. And I'm especially happy to have the folks here together on the panel with me to talk with us about some of their work and how they're thinking about the future. What I've asked them to do is to talk about a story that they've worked on recently that exemplifies the kind of work that High Country News does well and the kind of work they want to be doing in the future. The folks here today have helped bring some of our best and biggest stories to life, and I'm really happy to turn it over to them. I'm going to ask Bear if you'd go first, please. Bear is our photo editor, and turn it over to you, Bear.
Thanks, Jennifer. And thanks for that really thoughtful introduction to this webinar for us all. And thanks to everyone who's here today. I am going to share with y'all, it was really hard to choose which thing I wanted to share, as I'm sure it was for all of us, but I'm going to share a the photo essay that we ran in an issue that had a number of stories around the demise of coal in the West from February. But before I jump into that, and I'm actually going to share screen to show you all some of that photo essay. But before I jump into that, I want to preface why I chose that with a couple things. And so the first is that, you know, for me as photo editor, one thing that's really important is that we try, to me, it's really important that we try and push our visual storytelling beyond a more literal sort of version of the information that might be reported in a story, or you know, take a more straight photojournalistic approach. Always, it's not, sometimes that's absolutely the right thing to do, but sometimes I really love to see us push our visual storytelling more in a direction that helps readers make an emotional connection to what's at stake, or to those individuals or communities that are being impacted in some way. And so I think this photo essay does that, and that's one reason I wanted to show it to you. Another thing that's really important to me as a photo editor is bringing new voices into the magazine, and spending the time to help young photographers or photographers who are just starting out, or maybe who have a different experience in photography. It's really important to me to help them gain a foothold, especially if they're from underrepresented communities or from historically underrepresented backgrounds. So I definitely, it's really important to try and spend the time to talk through the contract or help develop pitches or whatever it might be. And this photo essay is kind of a case in point. And so I'm going to do the dreaded screen share here for a webinar and see if it actually works. Let's see, can y'all see that? Are y'all seeing that yet?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, close.
No, it's not working. Let's see. Let's try that again. Something's happening here. How about that?
There it is.
Yay.
Is it there? I'm not seeing the green line around my screen.
Yeah,
Are y'all
I can see
It's
it.
there.
We gotcha.
okay? So I'm starting with the cover because I really love this cover. It's one of my favorites. Great photograph from a great photographer, Dan Winters. And I just happen to know, Dan is a friend, and I happen to know that he had this image in his archive, and it felt really perfect for this issue. But so this photo essay came out of an initial call that I had with the photographer, Sage Brown. Sage is a great photographer, but he didn't have extensive editorial experience and had never worked with HCN. He gave me, we found some time to get on the phone one day and just talk through how we might be able to bring him into the magazine, what we expect in a pitch, what types of stories we're interested in, things like that. And so he shared a few ideas that he had, and this was a general idea at the time. He had recently heard that the only coal-fired power plant in the state of Oregon was going to be closing at the end of 2020. I immediately felt like that was a great story and one that I would love to run by everyone else. So the process when we run something by the team is that a photographer needs to put together a solid pitch, usually 1 to 2 paragraphs, with some background and why it's important. Share that first with the art department. So I run that by Cindy and Luna, and then if we sign off on it, then we take it to the desk editor. So in this case, the North desk editor was Emily Benson. She also thought that it was a great idea. And at that time, we also realized that there were a number of stories around coal floating around all the desks at the magazine. And that, in the end, I'm not going to go too far down that road, but in the end, that turned into the package that we kind of put together for that particular issue. And so Sage and I kind of developed this into the actual pitch and decided that the best approach would be that it was primarily a portrait project with extended captions in the worker's own words. So, you know, it's also really important to me that the process of working on the art or just deciding the art for the magazine is collaborative as possible for all of us in the magazine. McKenna and I, for instance, have spent many hours talking about art over the last year that we've both been at the magazine, and it's something that we both really geek out on a lot. But it's really important that we get started early in the process on the art and then make it as collaborative as possible. You know, I'm definitely one of those people that feels like collaboration almost always yields better results. And so in the case of this photo essay, looking at the logistics, looking at the time that Sage was going to have on the ground, lining things up at the plant, which was in the process of closing and being decommissioned, we decided that it would make the most sense for Carl, who's here today with us, to work together in the field on this. Now, we don't typically do that for a photo essay, but it worked out great. It allowed Sage to really focus on the photos, and Carl was able to really give the words, the workers' words, you know, the attention that we knew they would need. It was a little bit of a different approach, and one I can definitely foresee us doing more of in the future. And so I really love this photo essay because I feel like, you know, one thing we were really trying to figure out with this coal package as a whole, but which back to a point I made earlier, which I'm often trying to figure out in the art that we do and how the art supports stories, is how can we best humanize a certain story or certain situation? How can we help people make the connections that we want them to make? And so I really feel like this being primarily a portrait photo essay really does help to make this kind of human connection. I love the kind of detailed images that support the portraits. But this, you know, ends up being a story not just about the closure of this one particular plant, but to some extent, it helps to humanize this bigger story that's playing out across the West right now about the transition away from fossil fuels. I think most of us would say that's a good thing. But we also felt like, we also were feeling that it's important that we somehow remember or honor those individuals, those families, those communities that are being directly impacted by this shift. So, you know, back to that point about making an emotional connection, I feel like photography or photojournalism is at its best when it helps us to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, when it helps us to empathize, when it helps us to make these kinds of connections that we wouldn't otherwise make. And I think this photo essay really helps us do that. So I'm going to stop sharing for a sec and just before I turn it over, is it back to me now? Did I stop sharing properly? Okay, thanks. So I'm just going to end on this. A couple months later, we got a letter to the editor. We love getting letters to the editors, even the ones that aren't so happy with our reporting, but we appreciate that. We got a letter to the editor from a reader named Dean Heiser. If you're with us today, Dean, thank you for this letter. But I'm going to read just a little bit of it because I think it's relevant here. So he said, I've been a rabid coal hater for 40 years. My hate blinded me to the economic and emotional dislocation necessitated by our tragically delayed move away from coal as an energy source. The perspective from all of the pieces and end of the line moved me to tears and reminded me that we must remember the good people who will need our help to find purpose and livelihoods as we do the right thing for our planet. So, you know, that's one letter that kind of meant a lot to me personally, because I felt like he got it. You know, that's kind of what we were going for with this photo essay, and I was happy to see that he made those kind of connections. Happy to take questions about this. I think we're holding them until the end, though.
Okay, well, I can go next. So my name is Jessica, and I'm an assistant editor also based in Tucson. And I cover the Southwest region with a focus on environmental and social justice stories in the region. And so the story that I'm going to talk about today was my first feature for the magazine, and it was about the human impacts of extreme heat. And so, yeah, a little bit about like why I wanted to do that story is because, you know, as climate change becomes a bigger issue that everyone is concerned about, I realized that the impacts of extreme heat were kind of under the radar. Like we're all aware of wildfires and hurricanes and these kind of more visceral images that accompany climate change, but extreme heat is actually like the most deadly of the climate related impacts that we currently face. And that is nowhere more apparent than in Phoenix, Arizona, you know, one of the hottest parts of the country. And so I worked with McKenna to develop a pitch. She is our features editor, and she started last year. And so she was really instrumental in helping me kind of like brainstorm how to tackle this huge idea, because it does, you know, impacts people all over the country. And so we had a few brainstorming sessions and really decided on like a holistic approach. And so I interviewed very many different kinds of people, from grassroots organizers to science fiction writers to scientists and researchers, community members. There was a woman who she created a heat robot that kind of roams the city of Phoenix, and yeah, so that was kind of the approach we took. But one of the main, I think, reasons why I wanted to write that story is because it also follows my interest in covering kind of the inequality that leads to disproportionate impacts of climate change. And I think what came through in that story, and extreme heat ended up being like this really interesting topic to tackle that summer, is because, you know, areas and parts of Phoenix that were previously redlined are now the areas that experience the most heat compared to wealthier areas of the city. And in that same summer, we were also dealing with, or the Black Lives Matter movement was happening, and we were all becoming, you know, more aware of like racial injustice in the West and across the country. COVID was happening, and as I was reporting that story and the people that I was talking to, it became apparent that all those crises were kind of converging on the same groups of people. So, you know, communities of color that were dealing with police violence were also dealing with disproportionate impacts of heat. And one section of my story was about not housing insecurity, but it was about people living in mobile homes and their disproportionate impact to heat and heat-related deaths. And they were also the same group of people who suddenly didn't have cooling centers because of COVID. They couldn't go to libraries, you know, any place where they could have found refuge. Those were all taken away because of COVID. So it was a really interesting story to report, because I think I think it illustrates what we're trying to do at High Country News, which is show how these topics that we maybe didn't cover as much in the past are very intersectional with things like climate change and the environment and land use and policy. And I think that story was one example of that, but I think if you look at our magazines as a whole, it's these stories kind of working in conversation with each other. And I think to Bear's point is we're trying to humanize some of these stories that we've been telling for 50 years. So that was really cool too. Just gonna look at my time here. Oh, I think I've been talking for 5 minutes. So yeah, so that was mainly what I wanted to say about that story. So I will hand it off to the next person, which I believe is McKenna.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, and as Jess's editor, it was really, really fun to work with her on that story, and to kind of, that was right when I had started. So I got to know her through that, and it was really, there were a lot of challenges, as Jessica was saying, both between COVID and everything there, but also sort of backstory there is we got scooped by the Washington Post right after we had kind of gotten the good first draft going, and we're getting closer to publication. And so Jess was a champion. I had her completely rewrite it. And we went in a different direction, one that I thought was less sort of news feature-y and more narrative feature. And she just did an incredible job with it, and is sort of a unstoppable force, reporting force. So I'm the features director, and you know, I work on all the features that come out, and I've been here since August, and it's pretty hard to decide on what feature I would want to talk about, but something that's been feeling like a growing importance in all manners, but also just in my understanding of the West and how that's changing, is just the idea in which homelessness is not something that is limited to urban areas, or that is relegated to urban areas, and the way in which homelessness is a increasingly dangerous and difficult issue throughout the West, and in rural areas, in semi-urban areas. And so the story that I was thinking about, and that I think about a lot, honestly, since we did it, was a story about from the writer Leah Sotili. She's one of our correspondents and an incredibly rad journalist. And she had gotten a while ago a tip from someone whose distant relative had been killed by the police in Albany, a small town in Oregon. And the tipster, you know, gave Leah some materials to get her started. She really sort of dove into getting public records requests, into truly trying to understand how this person died, specifically by a taser. And, you know, obviously there's a pandemic of gun violence in the US, but there also is one actually with tasers as well, and that's really undercovered and rarely mentioned. Tasers are supposed to be non-lethal. That's the idea that is often kind of promoted about that. But there's a lot of cases of people dying by tasers, and especially in a lot of smaller communities, those deaths get written off as like, oh, that person just happened to also, you know, have a bad immune system, or that person was really old, so it's not the taser's fault that they died. There was a instance, I think, of a woman in her 80s or 90s who died by police taser, and it was written up as a fault of her for being old. And so there's these ways in which tasers can be really, the storytelling around them can get really complex and really take away the responsibility of the people using them, and instead putting them on a a person for existing in a lot of cases. And that's really, really common with homelessness. There's a lot of different ways that people who are unhoused are criminalized. Some of that is by just constant sort of interaction with police. Some of that is from, you know, inabilities to communicate due to maybe some like mental differences, abilities, and there's a lot of cases of people who are known in especially smaller communities and rural communities as people who are struggling with addiction, with just sort of an inability to hold down a job, and they become a spotlight for a certain kind of violence with our institutions. And so James Plymell, the story that this is about, he's a man who has struggled a lot in the past with addiction of different kinds and has spent a lot of his time trying to be in recovery, and had a number of very damaging physical accidents. He'd been hit by a car and his back was really injured, and he was spotted one day with his car. He was also unhoused. He was spotted one day with his car where he was living out of, just had broken down like slightly in part of the road. And a community service officer who's an officer in Albany PD who doesn't have a gun. They are supposed to be there more for, like, you know, parking violations and clearing out, you know, helping people in as sort of benign a way as possible usually. And the CSO, Jerry Morris, he pulled over, and within a few seconds of trying to push this car out of the road, Plymell was trying to push it out, and he said, you know, I have a really bad back injury. I'm not sure if I can push it out. And Jerry said, let's give it a try. And sort of within a few seconds, it had escalated from a man on the side of the road to a man whose car was full of his living belongings, whose speech was a little bit slow, who was having trouble moving because of his back. And the CSO called in other police officers who were armed. And when those police officers arrived, within, I think it was a minute and a half, tasers were employed, and things got out of control from there with Plymell unable to get out of the car because of his back and other physical ailments. And then multiple other police officers arriving, and each one sort of reading the scene based on what the person previously had done. And so that means just really, like, you know, one person tasering means that the other person coming in is going to be tasering even more aggressively. And within a few minutes, Plymell died. And it was a story that was totally it wasn't covered. It was something that it was blamed on Plymell for being an addict, and therefore, you know, his heart not being as strong. But all of the evidence showed that it was because of this unreasonable and extreme use of force. So there's just ways in which these stories happen, not in the places that we would always think, but very much in smaller towns and communities throughout the West, and primarily actually in the West. Some of the highest numbers of unhoused people are across the Western US. I'm done.
Thanks, McKenna. I'll go next. So the story that I am going to talk about is a feature I did on a local food cooperative here in the Spokane area. One of the kind of, I think, reasons we are sharing this process and sharing this story is to kind of let you readers into kind of what our reporting process looks like and what our story approval process looks like. And this was a really interesting one in that sense, because it started off as just a kind of small, quick news story on like this university-led program that was trying to connect farmers to each other and connect ranchers to each other to kind of share best practices. And then after sitting at a table in a ranch house for 2 or 3 hours, I called my editor, Emily Benson, and said, wow, like that was an amazing interview. And there was just so much more there than I expected. And that kind of got the ball rolling towards potentially this being a bigger story and a bigger project. And that ball rolled pretty slowly. It ended up being a year between that first interview, or a little over a year between that first interview and the eventual story publishing. And a big factor in that was that in the intervening time, a pandemic happened and is still happening. But I think that has just really shown the way that these stories kind of they evolve, and they take a lot of like perseverance to see where they continue to go. And as you continue to kind of follow the story and peel back these different layers. And then as Jennifer said in her introduction, there's also a real need to kind of be adjusting on the fly. That adjustment came in the form of, I think we were about 3 or 4 drafts in when McKenna came on board, and Emily, my editor, Emily, and I had been working on 3 to 4 drafts, and we were almost there. And then McKenna said, "No, you're not. There's just certain things that we could really work on, and to make this story that much better," which she always does and did in this case. So that was kind of we built this whole story, and then we kind of tore it down and built it back up from the bare bones. And I think that was at times a really frustrating experience, but also just like one of those examples of how bringing in new perspectives, and also bringing in people with such great backgrounds in like producing great journalism has really like Bear and McKenna and Jennifer and Brian has really just upped the level of the work that we do at High Country News, and really just it's an investment in storytelling and an investment in the future of the magazine. And I think that that's something that I really got to experience firsthand in this story, is in reporting and writing the story, is just how much room there is for growth for all of us, and how we can all kind of benefit from each other and make the best magazine possible. I'll kick it to you, Brian.
All right. Thanks, Carl. Well, as the newest person on staff, I don't have a lot of stories that I can lean on to highlight, but I would like to talk about a series that the Indigenous Affairs Desk is working on that we are hopefully going to be launching in August. And it's going to be based on what Indigenous environmental justice looks like, focusing on what's being termed the land back movement, which is this movement that is growing across the country of returning lands that have been ancestral lands to tribes and indigenous communities. And the series is really going to examine what happens when tribes regain control of their lands, and they have sovereignty and the ability to have sovereign governance over their lands. There's this, I think there are a lot of harmful tropes and stereotypes around Indigenous people. And one of them is that when a native community or a tribe or a native nation has land, that they are going to open a casino. And once they open the casino, it's going to attract crime and all kinds of other nefarious activity. And so based on that stereotype, people often, non-Indigenous people often oppose tribes regaining control of their lands. And so what we want to examine is what actually happens when tribes have control of their lands. What do they actually do? Sometimes they do open a casino, but that's actually pretty rare. Most times what they do is they restore ecological systems. They rebuild food systems. Oftentimes with the rebuilding of the land and the ecology of the land and the water and the air, what runs parallel to that is also programs that restore cultural practices, that restore and revitalize languages, ancestral languages. And so there are a lot of things that are intertwined with the land and with Indigenous people's connection to the land that can be examined and should be examined. And we see this happening across the country. And so the series is going to take a close look at that. We're going to highlight some really nice examples of that. And I'm really excited about it because I think it's going to not only kind of debunk some of those tropes and stereotypes about Native people, but it's also going to, I think, be some really uplifting storytelling about what can happen when you take lands that have oftentimes been damaged or desecrated and restore them with these kind of Indigenous principles. One thing I want to do is actually just remind the audience that if you want to ask questions of any of us, if you look at the bottom of your Zoom panel, there's a Q&A, little Q&A icon there. If you click on that, it'll open up a box and you can just type in the questions and those will go to our moderator.
Thank you, Brian, for reminding folks about the question box. And thank you all for sharing the kind of story behind the story and these recent pieces that you're passionate about. I do want us to have time for questions, but I also would like to just ask the panelists quickly to tell us about an issue that you think is going to be really important for High Country News to be keeping an eye on and be doing more, continual reporting on, whether short form or long form or some format that we're not even using yet. Just would like to get a sense from you all what you think we need to be focused on. And again, the audience, you can feel free to chime in the chat with your own thoughts about this. We'd love to hear from you through the chat as well. Jessica, would you lead off?
Sure. Yeah, so I think a story that we're going to be paying close attention to, or that I am at least, is the 30 by 30 Conservation Initiative. It's the new initiative by the Biden administration to conserve 30% of the land and waters in the United States. And they did release a, what would you call it, like a program overview of what they're planning to do. But it is quite vague still. And while I am like heartened by, there's definitely a change of tone under this administration around conservation, but also around, incorporating environmental justice principles into the plan, I do think there's going to be a need for a lot of accountability around this environmental justice aspect. I think in the past, when we've had similar initiatives to conserve land, including the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which was really successful, it took like decades before we came up with a companion program to address the fact that none of that funding was really going to cities. And so we have this big disparity in people in cities not living near parks and things like that, and underserved communities not receiving those benefits. And so I'm just going to be curious how they work with local. I actually saw one of the questions briefly about like doing more local reporting or local focus reporting. And I think that's one topic where it's going to be really important to look at how this is playing out on the ground and what that local engagement really looks like and who is being empowered to like be a part of those conversations and give their input. And I think we have a lot of systems that are unequal. And if we just plug this thing into those already unequal systems, we're going to get like a bad result. So I'm curious how they're going to like address those challenges and barriers for communities of color. And then to hand it off to Brian, who I think is going to go more into this. I think also just in general, we're constantly questioning the history of land conservation in the US and, you know, this idea that it's stolen indigenous land. And so we have to be like continuously thinking critically about these big initiatives that could really impact people in different ways. So I'll hand it over to Brian to talk about.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, I think the thing that I'm going to be watching closely, which is related to my comments earlier, are this land back movement. It is a growing movement. There are more and more non-Indigenous people, landholders, who are really interested and are actively pursuing returning their land back to the tribe or nation or community that has an ancestral connection with that land. And so what does that mean? Because at some point, if this movement continues to grow, the pieces of land are going to grow larger and larger. As you piece them together, it becomes a larger and larger land base, and it will become a political issue. It already has in some instances, but I think that there's a great potential for this to really redefine what land management means in the West. Because an Indigenous perspective on land management is often quite different from a Western perspective on land management. And so how those two forces run in parallel or run in opposition, I think is going to be a big story that plays out in the coming years.
Yeah, kind of piggybacking off what Brian said and what Jess said as well, and also one of the questions in the Q&A box. But I do think that one of the things that I'm really thinking about and that we all are kind of constantly talking about is the relationships between like communities and region-wide and nationwide and how those systems interact with each other. So, you know, for so long, the West has been a source of kind of natural resources for the rest of the country. And it's been a place that was kind of defined by taking. And now with things like the land back or 30 by 30, there's a renewed emphasis on the value of the land as a place that to be nurtured or to be preserved rather than to be extracted from. And I think that's just it's a monumental shift, and it's something that I know everyone here at High Country News is paying attention to and trying to wrap our hands around. And that, you know, and then in addition to that, as that focus changes to maybe nurturing or preserving, how does that impact the people who live here? Like the photo essay that Bear shared earlier, you know, who is having their livelihoods destroyed by no longer, you know, participating in these extractive economies. I think that the way that kind of all those things tie together is really important and really powerful.
I can kind of chime in too. Certainly one of the issues that I'm going to be looking at a lot is the spread of homelessness, as there's also the spread of people throughout the nation into more rural environments, and especially that's the case in the West. And those two things are pretty uniquely connected as well. And access to livable conditions, to, as more people are forced out of their homes and communities as a result of the effects of climate change, of rising heat, of drought, of wildfires, homelessness is going to be even more of an issue. And we have this moment, you know, with COVID, there's an estimated 30 million people in the US who are in danger of homelessness now as a result of the virus. And that number is obviously still growing. And so all of that and the pressures those put on our, the land around us, the land under us, the air, those are always going to be really key. And, you know, a lot of the ways that we're going to tell those stories are through really local stories. And it's been really fascinating and fun in the journalism sense, which doesn't mean like fun, this is haha great, but like something to be really engaged with and really connected to is sort of how these issues are playing out in specific communities.
I'll just be quick so we can get to have some little time for questions, but kind of following what McKenna said and also related to the story about James Plymell that she mentioned earlier, I'd love to see us expand our coverage of the criminal justice system. That story did a great job of touching on what we know to be some of the disproportionate impacts on vulnerable populations, in this case of, you know, an unhoused individual, but also of course on communities of color and other communities. So I'm curious, you know, I think I have a number of questions that I'd love to see us kind of dig into in different communities. And so kind of the idea of what does justice mean today? What does it mean to different communities? How do communities hold police departments and other parts of the criminal justice system accountable? How do we evolve our criminal justice system to more accurately reflect the needs and desires of our region's diverse communities? How do we reimagine policing? I think there's a lot of discussion around that right now. What's working, what's not working? How are things like policing changing in rural areas today? Yeah, so I think that's something I'd love to see us cover more, both at the regional level, but also in a way to address one of the questions I saw pop up before, also really bringing that down to the local level would be great.
Well, thank you guys all for sharing your thoughts and what you're paying attention to. We've got some attendees also chiming in the chat as well as the Q&A. A couple of different folks are reminding us, of course, we don't need reminding that water is an issue that we have to be paying very close attention to. That is just a very standard beat for High Country News, and will continue to be. Peter Jers has asked in the Q&A, has suggested this needs to be at the top of our agenda. Jessica, could I ask you to just talk really quickly about some of the work we're discussing in this area?
Yeah, so yeah, on the South Desk, we have been covering the water shortages with the Colorado River. And I will say we have two collaborations or two projects right now. We have a water desk grant that was given to us last year to cover water in California specifically. So we've done a series of stories addressing water in that state. And we also recently, and I'll see if maybe Gretchen, she's been posting links to some of these things. We also just did a collaboration with INN, which the name is evading me right now, what that stands for. It's like a nonprofit news not, I don't remember what it was.
Institute for Nonprofit News.
Institute for Nonprofit News. Okay, I was like messaging page trying to figure that out. And so we did a collaboration with them on a series of stories as well that are being shared with other news organizations. So yeah, it's definitely something we're constantly thinking about and also finding funding for to do those stories.
Kit Miller has asked how our interns are doing and what they're up to. I posted a couple of recent stories from our interns in the Q&A. The interns have always been really essential to how the magazine gets made. Interns at High Country News have never delivered coffee or ran the copier. They've always been out reporting. And Carl and Jessica, who are here on the panel, began as interns a few years back. So interns do tend to stay with the organization and grow with the organization. And we're lucky to have them stay when they stay, and when they don't stay, they go off and do incredible things for other magazines as journalists and editors, as many have. And as Michelle Nyhouse spoke about on the previous panel to this one in the series, particularly. Let's see, I'm looking at your questions. We have just a few more minutes for them. There's a lot of comments showing up in the Q&A, which is great. Looking for ones that end in question marks, and I'm not, there are a lot of comments in there. Thank you all for your comments. They're really great. We love them. Zero emissions efforts. Kenneth Vogler has a question here. Actually, there's no question mark on the question. Really interesting comment here about zero emissions. Alex Kinsey has a comment.
I could say a little bit about Kenneth's question. I think one of the really interesting things that we're going to be looking at, and there was a story from Maya Kapoor a few months ago, was how the effort to get to zero emissions is going to be impacting communities through efforts like mining or dam removal. And I think it's really important as we pursue climate change or climate adaptation and resilience and cutting fossil fuels, that we're also not putting the blinders on to the impacts of renewable energy and the impacts on communities. So I think Maya's piece on the lithium mines proposed in Northern Nevada was an example of kind of recognizing that this transition is not without its impacts as well. So it's really something that we need to have an eyes wide open approach to addressing.
Agree. There's just no shortage of issues and intersections of issues and complications of issues, and we're living in a really complex world, and yet when you see how everything intersects and is related, there's something kind of calming about that, just to know that it all is part of this greater system that we get to be a part of as well, and also have the ability to sort of step back and think deeply about and ask questions about and try to answer those questions publicly to help other people think about those questions too. And that's what I've always loved about being in journalism and in magazines, is you get to very publicly reckon with your own deepest questions and fears and joys, and try to share that with a reader and give a reader an experience they may not otherwise have. And in some ways, maybe that helps them evolve their own thinking, or maybe even change their thinking about an issue. Or just plain out, just feel joyous for a minute, and just happy to be here, be living in the West, or if you're not living in the West, thinking about a place you feel fondly about and have spent good times in, and care about a lot. And I think that caring is kind of what ties everybody in this community together. So I just will say, thank you again for being part of the community and being on this wild ride, living in the West, that we all are on, and supporting our work. And I am going to hand it back to Greg now for a few words before we all depart. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer and Carl and Bear and Jessica and McKenna and Brian. Really, really appreciate the conversation today. And thanks to a couple of staffers who've been working mightily behind the scenes. Laura Dixon, who's in Bend, Oregon, and then Gretchen King, who's in Durango, or not Durango. I know where she is. It's always sunny there. It's Gunnison, Colorado. You've, for everyone who's tuning in, you have heard from High Country Newsers today who are in Spokane, Tucson, several different burgs in California, Seattle, Gunnison, Bend, Oregon. This is a community and an organization that is spread all across the West right now. It's a region that is changing quickly, and an organization and a publication that is changing along with it. I hope this was enlightening and useful to everybody. Please do check out our website. There's so much more to High Country News than you might see in the magazine these days. We publish pretty much daily on our website. We have gatherings like this, and of course, events. I have to do my part and once again remind you that June 4th is the big 50th anniversary celebration for High Country News. We had really hoped to have this one in person in Denver at the Botanic Gardens. We're going to do it by Zoom, but we hope you all will be there. Please bring a glass of something to raise to High Country News and to the remarkable community of people who have gathered around this organization and who make our work possible. This is a reader-supported nonprofit organization. We would not be able to do the work that we do without all of you. So thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for your support. Thanks for being here today. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your Thursday. Take care.